The microphones were already waiting when his son asked about soup. Not figuratively, literally. 43 journalists, 17 cameras. Broadcast vans lined along the estate gates like a wall of chrome and glass. And right there, in the middle of all of it, a 5-year-old boy named Tavin pressed his small hand into his mother's coat pocket and tugged twice. She felt it. Lyran Ashford-Varelli felt every single pull. The breaking news banner had already crossed every major financial network 17 minutes earlier. Bright red letters. Sharp font. No hesitation in how they typed it. Varelli Syndicate heir under paternity investigation. 8 words. That's all it took to unravel 6 years. The estate gates were iron, black, tall enough to make a grown man feel small. And Lyran stood on the inside of them, still watching through the gap where the driveway curved toward the road. She didn't move toward the cameras. She didn't step back either. She just watched the banner loop on the broadcast monitor. A security aide was holding 12 feet away from her like it was evidence at a trial. Stock values had dipped 8% by 6 in the evening. Board emergency lines lit up before 7. And at exactly 7:12 p.m., Selim Varelli, head of the Varelli Syndicate, the man whose last name sat on 3 international towers and 1 federal infrastructure contract, walked out of the estate's east corridor and stopped just short of the main entrance. He was dressed perfectly. That was the first thing Lyran noticed. Not concern. Not urgency. Perfectly pressed dark suit. No tie. Collar open by exactly 1 button. The kind of appearance that takes 20 minutes and a mirror to manufacture when someone has been expecting this moment. He held a single sheet of paper. His publicist, a woman named Dree Calloway, stood 3 steps behind him. She gave 1 small nod when their eyes met across the corridor. That's when Lyran understood. This was rehearsed. Selim cleared his throat. He looked at the legal team flanking the entrance, then at the press coordinator who was already signaling the cameras outside. He spoke in a calm, measured voice, the kind of voice trained for earnings calls and Senate subcommittee hearings. Effective immediately, Lyran Ashford-Varelli has been placed on temporary administrative suspension from all Varelli Syndicate operational roles, pending independent DNA confirmation of claimed biological ties. This action is taken to protect the integrity of the company, its shareholders, and its succession structure during the period of review. He did not look at her. Not once. And what shattered wasn't the accusation. It was how professionally it was delivered. Lyran had sat through boardroom ambushes before. She had watched rivals try to pull the ground out from under her using legal motions and coordinated leaks. She had handled every single one. But this was different, because this came from inside the estate, from inside the marriage, delivered through a press release written in 3rd person about a woman who was standing 10 feet away. Hi viewers. Have you ever watched someone you trusted completely hand a microphone to the world and describe your life like you weren't in the room? Tell me in the comments. 1 word, what would you do? The cameras began flashing through the gate. Tavin tugged again. Lyran looked down. He was 5 years old. Brown eyes. His father's jaw even at that age. He was wearing a gray hoodie that was slightly too big. And in his left hand he was holding something loose and careful. The way children hold things they know are important. A small crumpled collection of coins. He looked up at her with complete calm. "Mommy," he said, "I brought $1.43. He paused, tilted his head. "Is that enough for soup?" The estate was worth $412 million. Tavin had $1.43, and he wanted to know if that was enough. Lyran did not answer right away. She looked at her son. Then she looked at Selim. He had turned back toward the corridor. He was already speaking quietly to his publicist, already moving on to the next step in whatever sequence this press release belonged to. He did not kneel. He did not look back. The cameras kept flashing. A senior journalist outside pressed a recorder through the gate bars and shouted a question about succession rights and DNA verification timelines. 2 others followed. The broadcast vans adjusted their satellite dishes. Someone on the financial desk was already updating the ticker. Lyran picked up Tavin, coins and all, and turned away from the gate. Away from the cameras. Away from the statement. Away from Selim's perfectly pressed suit and his carefully crafted corporate language. She carried her son back toward the kitchen, one hand steady under his small legs, his coins still warm in his fist. And as she walked, a single thought broke through everything else. Not grief, not rage, something colder. The DNA lab. She had heard the name once. Fast, almost casual. In a legal briefing 3 months ago. Helix Core Biotech. Listed as the processing facility for all Varelli medical verifications. Standard language. Buried in a contract appendix nobody was meant to read twice. But Lyran had read it twice. And now, with her son's coins pressed against her shoulder and 43 journalists screaming behind iron gates, one question sat at the center of everything. If this was corporate protection, why did Selim go public first instead of handling it privately? Because men with power who want truth go quiet. Men with agendas go to press. The lab's name echoed again in her mind. Helix Core Biotech. And attached to it, barely visible, a parent company listed in a Delaware filing she hadn't finished reading. She was going to finish reading it tonight. The archive room on the lower level of the Varelli corporate building was not designed for long nights. 1 overhead light. 2 filing cabinets that hadn't been updated since a remodel 4 years ago. A desk the size of a folding table. And a laptop that had been issued to Lyran 18 months ago when she was still listed as Chief Operations Partner. A title that now existed in a legal gray zone thanks to tonight's press release. She didn't care about the title. She cared about the filing. It was 11:47 p.m. when she pulled up the Helix Core Biotech public registration documents and laid them flat on the screen beside the Varelli corporate contract appendix. Side by side. The overhead light buzzed once and steadied. The lab name appeared in the appendix under approved third-party medical verification providers. No flag, no asterisk, just a name. She started with the ownership structure. Helix Core Biotech, incorporated in Delaware, registered address in a shared office suite in Wilmington. Listed its majority investment source as a fund called Draxon Capital Group. She typed the name into the financial registry database. Draxon Capital Group. The results loaded in 4 seconds. Private equity. Alternative assets. Hostile acquisition history across 3 sectors over 7 years. And listed in the rival competitive entities section of the Varelli Syndicate's own internal risk document. A document Lyran had helped write 14 months ago. This matters. Pause on that. Helix Core wasn't an independent lab. Helix Core was majority funded by the Varelli Syndicate's direct competitor. She leaned back. 1 breath. Then she went back to the screen and pulled the DNA processing timestamps from the certified results document Selim's legal team had submitted internally 2 days before the public announcement. The sample had been submitted on a Tuesday. Results were returned by Wednesday morning. 14 hours. Standard DNA paternity processing, even with expedited commercial lab services, takes a minimum of 3 to 5 business days. Federal regulatory guidelines for admissible verification in succession disputes require a minimum 72-hour processing window with dual chain of custody documentation. 14 hours wasn't fast. 14 hours was impossible, unless the result was written before the sample arrived. Lyran opened a second window and pulled the raw metadata embedded in the PDF document Selim's legal team had distributed. Document creation timestamp. Last modified field. Author field. The creation timestamp read Monday, 6:14 a.m. The sample submission timestamp read Tuesday, 9:47 a.m. The document existed before the sample was submitted. She didn't move for a full minute. The overhead light buzzed again. The building was empty. 2 security guards on rotating rounds outside. No one else in the archive room. Just her, the documents, and a silence that kept getting louder the more she read. She pulled the Varelli Corporate Board Charter next. Article 9. Emergency Succession Clause. Activated when a primary heir's biological eligibility is placed under formal legal review. Upon activation, and this was the part that made her jaw tighten, the board gained authority to schedule an emergency vote on succession restructuring within 48 hours of the triggering event. The press release went out at 7:12 p.m. The emergency succession clause was activated at 7:31 p.m. 19 minutes later, someone had a countdown running before Selim ever walked to that entrance. This wasn't betrayal. Not exactly. Betrayal requires impulse, emotion, a moment where someone breaks. This was timing, sequenced, layered, coordinated down to the minute. The question wasn't whether someone had manufactured this. The question was who activated Article 9 before the press release even finished airing. She scrolled to the board charter's amendment log. The emergency succession clause had been modified, subtly, in language most people wouldn't catch 8 months ago. The amendment added a provision allowing the clause to be triggered by documented third-party laboratory findings, rather than requiring a court order. One change, 8 months ago, buried in amendment language. And the lab that produced the findings was funded by the competitor the amendment was designed to benefit. Lyran saved every document, every timestamp, every metadata field into a single encrypted folder, and backed it to an external drive she locked in her coat pocket. She closed the laptop. The overhead light buzzed one more time. She stood up, pulled her coat tight, and walked toward the exit. And then her phone lit up. An encrypted notification. No sender name. The subject line was 4 words. Check tomorrow morning's schedule. She opened the attachment. A board meeting notice. Emergency session. 8:30 a.m. Agenda item. Formal vote on removal of Tavin Varelli from primary succession designation pending paternity resolution. Her son's name. On a board agenda. Scheduled for tomorrow morning. They weren't waiting for DNA results. They were voting before the results could be challenged. The kitchen in the Varelli estate was large enough to feel empty even with people in it. Marble counters. A window above the sink that looked out onto the east garden, where security lights threw pale gold circles across the lawn. Tavin sat at the kitchen island at 8:22 p.m. He had changed out of the gray hoodie. He was wearing pajamas now. Dark blue with small white stars across the collar. His feet didn't reach the floor. They hung there, swinging slightly, the way a child's feet do when the stool is just a little too tall. He had arranged his coins on the counter. In a line, smallest to largest. A penny, then another penny, then a dime, then a quarter. Then 3 more pennies. Then a nickel. Then a quarter again. He was counting them with one finger, pushing each one slightly to the right after he touched it. Lyran stood at the far counter. She had set water to boil 20 minutes ago without really deciding to. Now it was hot. She found a can of chicken broth in the back of the cabinet behind the olive oil. Tavin looked up. "Is that soup?" he asked. "It will be," she said. He nodded and went back to his coins. Selim came in at 8:31 p.m. He walked through the side entrance, stopped at the edge of the kitchen. He looked at Tavin first, then at the stove, then at nothing for a moment that lasted just long enough to notice. He didn't sit down. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved between his son and the counter and the window, like he was trying to find a place to land. Tavin looked up. "Hi, Daddy," Selim said. "Hey." That was it. "Hey." Lyran kept stirring. On the television mounted in the corner of the kitchen, the one usually tuned to the financial news channel, a broadcast anchor was mid-sentence. She caught fragments. ongoing paternity question at the Varelli Syndicate, and sources indicate the board has already. And then Tavin said, "Can you turn it up?" And both adults said, "No," at the same moment. Tavin looked at them both. He didn't ask again. He pushed another coin to the right. The broadcast shifted to a compiled clip reel. Footage from the estate gates earlier that evening. Camera flashes, the crowd of journalists. Lyran walking away from the entrance with Tavin on her hip. Then a freeze frame. Her face turned slightly, one hand steadying him, his coins visible in his fist. A graphic appeared below the freeze frame. Alpha King ignores son during press crisis. Selim's eyes went to the screen. He didn't look away from it. His jaw moved once. Not speech, just pressure. Something happening in him that he wasn't going to say out loud. Not tonight, maybe not ever. Lyran watched him the way she had learned to watch him over 6 years. Looking for the space between what he said and what he felt. Tonight that space was wide. He was standing in his own kitchen like a man who wasn't sure he still had a right to be there. It should have felt satisfying. Didn't. "Soup's ready," she said. She put the bowl in front of Tavin. Small bowl. Warm. A few crackers from the cabinet set alongside it. He looked at it for 1 second, then reached into the line of coins and pushed all of them across the counter toward her. "Here," he said. "For the soup." Lyran looked at the coins. $1.43. Every cent of it. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at her son. His earnest face, his careful hands, the way he held himself with a kind of quiet dignity that no 5-year-old should have to know how to carry. "Keep it," she said. "This one's on the house." He smiled, small and quick, and went back to his soup. Selim had not moved. Lyran turned back to the stove. She cleaned the pot. She rinsed the ladle. She kept her back to the room until she heard the side door open again, and then close. He was gone. She stood at the sink for a long moment after. The kitchen was quiet again. The broadcast had moved on to a different story. Tavin finished his soup without asking about the coins again. At 9:04 p.m., Lyran's phone received a new message. Encrypted. Same format as the one she'd gotten in the archive room. No sender name. One line this time. The lab was purchased 2 months before testing began. She read it twice. Set the phone face down on the counter. The water had gone cold in the sink. Someone out there knew more than the timestamps. And they wanted her to know they knew. The only question was why. The financial district didn't sleep. It just lowered its voice. 10 a.m. the next morning, Lyran walked into the glass tower on Meridian Avenue that housed, among other things, a private equity consulting office on the 22nd floor. The elevator moved without a sound. She had received the meeting request at 6:47 a.m., a message from an assistant she didn't recognize, using a firm name she'd seen in financial filings twice in the past 48 hours. The name on the door read, Okafor Reed Capital Advisory. Inside, the office was minimal. One long window, 2 chairs, a table with nothing on it except a closed laptop and a ceramic coffee mug that had been there long enough to leave a ring. Marcus Reed was already seated. He stood when she walked in. He extended his hand. "Lyran Ashford Varelli." "Marcus Reed," she said. "You own minority shares in HelixCore Biotech." He tilted his head. A small acknowledgement. Not quite a smile. "Sit down," he said. "This is going to take a few minutes." She sat. He opened the laptop. He pulled up a document she had not seen before. An internal acquisition record showing the purchase timeline of HelixCore Biotech shares across 3 distinct tranches. The first tranche, purchased 14 months ago. Second, 8 months ago, the same month the board charter amendment was filed. Third, 2 months before the DNA testing. He turned the screen toward her. "I hold 7%, he said. "Minority. Not enough to control anything." but enough to see the full shareholder communication trail. He clicked to the next document, a digital audit of the DNA test PDF. More detailed than what Lyran had pulled from the metadata, this one showed not just the creation timestamp, but also embedded watermark irregularities in the document header. The watermark sequence used for certified helix core test results followed a specific alphanumeric code structure. The code in Tavin's result document didn't match the current helix core certification format. It matched the format from 2 software versions ago. A format helix core had retired 11 months back. The document was generated using outdated internal software, Marcus said. Either this test was processed nearly a year ago, which is impossible, or someone pulled an old template and used it to backfill results. Lyran looked at the screen. She looked at the watermark comparison side by side. "Why are you showing me this?" she said. He leaned back. "Because I benefit if the corruption behind this gets exposed." She waited. Draxon Capital, Helix Core's majority funder, has been running a quiet hostile pressure campaign against 3 mid-sized syndicates in this market. The Varelli syndicate is the largest. If your succession structure gets destabilized, Draxon's preferred board candidates get seated. Acquisition leverage goes up. The fund profits. He paused. "I hold competing positions. Draxon's play hurts my portfolio. So yes, I want this exposed. That's the full truth." She appreciated that. The honesty of self-interest was cleaner than pretend altruism. "What else do you have?" she said. He pulled up a third document, a financial transfer log, shell company transactions through 3 LLC entities. The transfers totaled just over $9 million, timed between 6 weeks before and 2 weeks after the DNA results were submitted. 2 of these LLCs trace back to board members, he said. Specifically, 3 with voting seats on the succession committee. He let that land. They moved money before the announcement. She stared at the screen. "They shorted the company stock," she said. 3 of them, he confirmed. Before the story broke. The room was quiet. This wasn't a marriage falling apart in front of cameras. This was a coordinated financial play using her son's name as the instrument. Her 5-year-old. His coins. His soup. Used as leverage in a stock scheme. She kept her face steady and looked at Marcus Reed with the same calm she had used in boardrooms for 6 years. "Can you certify these records?" she said. "I already have," he said. "Notarized copies. Time-stamped digital backups on a third-party server." "Then we have a problem with your timeline," she said. "The board vote is in 20 minutes. Marcus closed the laptop. He picked up a folder from the chair beside him, the one she hadn't noticed when she walked in, and laid it on the table. "That's why I asked you here at 6:47, he said. Inside the folder was a legal injunction filing. Pre-drafted. Her name listed as the filing party. 3 board members named as respondents. The grounds: market manipulation, fraudulent succession documentation, and conflict of interest in a shareholder vote. She read the first page. She turned to the second. "This was filed by your attorney," she said. "My attorney drafted it," he said. "You need your own counsel to submit it, but it's ready. It only needs your authorization." She looked at Marcus Reed. She did not fully trust him. His motivations were honest, but his interests were his own. He would use this and use her cooperation in it in whatever way benefited his portfolio. That was fine. She didn't need to trust him. She needed the filing. "Call your attorney," she said. He was already reaching for his phone. But as she stood, one thought surfaced through everything. 3 board members had shorted Varelli stock before the story broke. 3. Which meant the question wasn't just who funded the lab or drafted the results. The question was whether Selim had known about all 3 of them or only one. The boardroom on the 41st floor had floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides. Today the sky was flat gray. Low clouds. Everything felt pressed down from above. The emergency session had been called to order at 8:30 a.m. sharp. 14 board members, the succession committee, 2 corporate attorneys along the wall. A court-appointed observer from the regulatory office who had arrived at 8:14 and hadn't said a word since. Lyran walked in at 8:28. She sat in her designated seat, still listed on the placard, not yet formally removed, at the far end of the table. She set her folder down. She did not look at the 3 succession committee members seated across from her. She looked at Selim. He was at the head of the table. He looked tired. Not the strategic tired of a man performing for press. Genuinely tired. Like he'd been awake since yesterday and hadn't found a reason to stop being awake. The session chair, Brenton Halsey, 22-year board member, reading glasses on a cord around his neck, called the meeting to order. This emergency session is convened pursuant to Article 9 of the Varelli Syndicate Charter. The motion before this board, formal vote on the temporary removal of Tavin Selim Varelli from the primary succession register pending paternity review. All members are required to vote. He looked around the table. We'll begin with the succession committee's recommendation. Darren Aldridge, on the board 11 years, and the man Lyran now knew had moved $2.4 million through an LLC 9 days before the press release. Adjusted his tie and opened a folder. He began speaking. Lyran did not hear most of it. She was watching Selim. He was watching Aldridge. Something in his face had shifted. The controlled blankness was still there, but underneath it, in the small muscles around his jaw and the way his hands sat flat on the table, something had opened up, like a question he hadn't yet let himself ask. Halsey called the first procedural vote. 11 members raised hands in favor of proceeding. 1 abstained. Selim. He did not raise his hand. He said one word. Abstain. Clear. Flat. Into the room without explanation. Aldridge's eyes moved toward him for less than a second. Then the door opened. Marcus Reed walked in with 2 attorneys flanking him. Behind them, a process server. The process server crossed to the session chair and placed a document on the table in front of Halsey. Legal injunction filing, the process server said. Filed this morning at 8:09 a.m. in the district court. Names 3 members of this board as respondents. Grounds include market manipulation, fraudulent succession documentation, and conflict of interest in the current vote. Halsey picked up the document. The room went very still. Aldridge leaned forward. This is improper procedure. A court filing doesn't. The injunction includes a request to stay this vote pending judicial review, one of Marcus's attorneys said, cutting across him evenly. Additionally, we are formally notifying this board that a federal audit request has been submitted to the Securities Regulatory Division regarding the financial positions held by 3 succession committee members in the 30 days preceding the public paternity announcement. Audit. That word moved through the room like a current. 2 of the board members seated near the window shifted in their chairs. One reached for his phone under the table and then stopped himself. Halsey read the first page of the injunction, then the second. His reading glasses moved slowly down the bridge of his nose. Is counsel for the board prepared to respond to this filing? He asked. The corporate attorney along the wall stood up. We'll need time to review the claims before. How much time? Halsey said. At minimum, 72 hours. Halsey set the document down. Then this vote is tabled pending legal review, he said. He knocked the gavel once. Looked at no one in particular. We're adjourned. Aldridge said something sharp to the attorney beside him. 2 succession committee members were already on their phones. The court-appointed observer stood, straightened his jacket, and picked up his briefcase without a word. He had heard enough. The room emptied. Lyran sat for a moment. Still, she watched Selim push back from the table. He stood. He looked across the room toward her, and for the first time since the press release and the coins on the counter, their eyes held. She looked back. Then she picked up her folder and walked toward the exit. Marcus fell into step beside her in the corridor. "That bought us time," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "The audit could take weeks." "I know." He glanced at her. "Ready for what comes after it confirms everything?" She pushed through the stairwell door. "I've been ready since the metadata timestamps." But on the landing, her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize. No name. No signature. For lines. "Audit won't be the end of it. The sample ID numbers in the lab report. Check them against the Helix Core internal registry. They were altered manually." She stopped. The sample ID numbers. If the IDs were manually changed, someone had direct access to Helix Core's filing system. Someone who could touch records that were never supposed to be touched. And that system logged every change. Which meant a trail existed that the people who built this scheme didn't know was still there. She put the phone in her pocket. "We need the Helix Core internal registry," she said. Marcus was already typing. The audit confirmation didn't arrive with fanfare. No press release. No announcement. Just an email. Sent at 6:03 a.m. From the Securities Division Field Office to Varelli Syndicate Corporate Counsel. Subject line: Preliminary Findings. Helix Core Biotech Financial Review. 3 pages. Lyran read all 3 standing in the corridor outside her temporary office. Still in the coat she hadn't taken off from the night before. The building was empty at that hour. Just her and the hum of the overhead lights and the kind of silence that only exists in places built for noise. The first page confirmed what the metadata had already suggested. Helix Core had received irregular funding transfers, routed through an intermediary account linked to Draxon Capital, over the 14 months preceding the DNA test submission. Not standard investment deposits. Structured disbursements. Timed in increments small enough to avoid automatic flagging. Large enough, collectively, to fund a full operational pivot. Pause on that. They weren't just funding the lab. They were funding what the lab was going to do. The second page was where the language shifted. An insurance clause. Buried inside the Varelli Syndicate's own corporate liability structure, in a section that hadn't been reviewed in 4 years, was a succession instability provision. If the primary heir designation was placed under formal legal challenge, the clause triggered an automatic insurance valuation adjustment on 3 long-term corporate asset policies. The adjustment inflated the payout potential significantly. Someone had modified that clause 9 months ago. 1 sentence added. 17 words. The kind of change that looks like routine legal housekeeping until you understand what it unlocks. The third page was the clearest. Stock volatility modeling, run internally by Draxon Capital analysts and recovered from a document cache the audit subpoenaed, showed projections built specifically around a Varelli Syndicate succession challenge scenario. They had modeled it before it happened, with target price ranges, timing windows, and position sizes. They hadn't reacted to the scandal. They had scheduled it. Lyran folded the printout and placed it inside her coat. "Power doesn't destroy families for love," she said to the empty corridor. "It does it for leverage." Marcus called at 6:47 a.m. She answered before the second ring. "You saw it," he said. "All 3 pages. The insurance clause is the clearest piece," he said. 17-word amendment, 9 months ago. That ties Draxon's financial modeling directly to an internal charter modification. Not circumstantial. That's coordination. "Who authorized the amendment?" she said. A pause. "Long enough to mean something. That's the part you need to see in person," he said. She was already moving toward the elevator. The amendment authorization log listed 2 names. One was a mid-level corporate attorney who had left the firm 3 months after the filing, his forwarding address traced to an LLC registered in the Cayman Islands. The second name was one of the 3 board members who had shorted Varelli stock before the announcement. But there was a third field on the log. An approver field. Amendments at this level required a senior operational partner to co-sign before filing. Usually a formality, but always documented. The co-signer on this one had signed off electronically on a Tuesday afternoon in a month Lyran remembered clearly, because she had been at a board summit that week. Selim hadn't been at the summit. She checked his calendar twice. He had been in the office that Tuesday. She sat with that for a long moment, not moving, not reacting, just letting it settle into the right place inside her, where it wouldn't cloud what came next. He may not have known what he was signing. Possible. He may have understood exactly what it was. Also possible. The truth was almost certainly in the middle, and the middle was the most dangerous place of all because it couldn't be answered with evidence. Only by the man himself. Then the second email arrived. Forensic Document Analyst. Subject: Helix Core Sample Registry. Manual alteration confirmed. The original sample ID numbers were in the internal registry. The altered ID numbers were in the certified result document. They didn't match. The registry also showed the timestamp of the alteration, performed 3 days before Selim's press release. 3 days before he walked to that entrance in his perfectly pressed suit and read a statement about corporate integrity. Someone had manipulated the sample records, waited 3 days, then handed Selim a clean-looking document and let him carry it in front of 43 journalists. He had been used. The scale of it, now fully visible, was extraordinary in the worst way. Not passion. Not marital collapse. A coordinated financial scheme that used a 5-year-old child's identity, a father's trust, and a family's name as instruments of market positioning. 3 board members. A rival fund. A lab with altered records, and a cosign on an amendment that may or may not have meant what it looked like it meant. The question now wasn't just what had been done. It was what Selim was going to do with the part that still belonged to him. The estate gates looked different the second time. Same iron, same height, 12 broadcast vans instead of 43. The energy outside was quieter, waiting, not demanding. The press corps had registered that something had shifted and they were repositioning, not yet sure which direction the story would land. It was 11:14 a.m. when Lyran walked to the entrance from the inside. No prepared statement. That was intentional. The official notice had gone through Varelli Corporate Counsel 40 minutes earlier. For sentences, the DNA certification submitted by Helix Core Biotech had been invalidated by federal auditors due to documented regulatory violations in sample processing, chain of custody handling, and document integrity. The result could not be relied upon in any legal or corporate proceeding. Tavan Selim Varelli's status as primary biological heir remained legally uncontested. All board actions initiated under Article 9 were hereby void. No drama in the language, no accusations. Just policy correction in the flattest possible tone because that was what the lawyers recommended and she had agreed with the lawyers on this one. Outside the gate, reporters were already moving cameras. Questions started before she was fully visible through the iron. Ms. Ashford Varelli, can you confirm the lab findings were fraudulent? Is the board facing criminal charges? Has Mr. Varelli issued a personal apology? What does this mean for succession going forward? She stopped at the gate. Cameras tightened. She didn't reach for a microphone stand. She held no notes. She stood still, hands loose at her sides, and spoke in a voice that was completely unhurried. The audit results are part of the public record, she said. The regulatory bodies handling the review are the appropriate source for further detail. What I can tell you is that Tavan's status was never in legitimate question. That's the part that needs to be said clearly. One reporter pressed forward through the others. Will you and Mr. Varelli appear jointly to address the personal dimensions of this situation? She looked at that camera for 2 full seconds, then shifted to the one beside it. I'm addressing the public now, she said. She turned and walked back up the driveway. Selim had been standing 12 feet behind her the entire time. She had known he was there from the moment she stepped through the east entrance. She could feel his presence the way you feel a change in a room's temperature. Not intrusive, just real. He had taken one step forward when the first question landed. She had not looked back. He didn't follow her to the gate. Later, the footage would be edited by 4 different networks and shared across platforms under captions like, "She stood alone," and "No backup needed," and one that simply read "Foundation." The clip contained no confrontation, no dramatic exchange, just a woman at iron gates answering questions calmly, while the man who had issued the original press release stood 12 feet back in silence. The public understood what they were seeing without being told how to read it. Inside, Lyren found Tavin in the sitting room working a floor puzzle. He didn't look up right away. When he did, his face was careful in the way a child's face gets careful when they've been sitting with a question for a long time. "Are we going to be okay?" he said. She sat on the floor beside the puzzle, picked up a piece. "We were always going to be okay," she said. He looked at her a moment longer than necessary, checking something internal against what she'd said, then nodded and went back to the puzzle. She held the piece in her hand without placing it. The room was warm, still, the kind of quiet that had weight to it. She placed the puzzle piece finally. To fit, she stayed on the floor for another minute, not thinking about any one thing, just being in the room with her son, with the warmth of the house around them, with the simple fact that they were both here and unhurt and still standing. Tavin pushed 2 pieces together and looked pleased with himself. "I got it," he said. "You did," she said. She stood up slowly and went to the kitchen to get them both water. The puzzle was a map of the United States, something his teacher had sent home during the suspension period, before Tavin had returned to school, back when keeping him occupied at home was a daily project. He had been working it in pieces for 3 weeks. He was close now, maybe another 2 evenings. She handed him the water. He drank it without looking away from the puzzle. From where she stood, she could see the driveway through the side window. The broadcast vans were pulling away one by one. The questions had dried up for the afternoon. The cameras had what they came for. Tomorrow they would edit it into whatever the story needed to be. She had stopped trying to control that part. The only part she could control was this room, this boy, these pieces on the floor. She sat back down beside him and picked up another piece. They worked the puzzle together until the light in the room shifted from afternoon to early evening, and nobody called, and nothing required her attention, and the quiet held. One question still open. One the audit hadn't resolved and the official statement hadn't touched and the reporters outside hadn't yet framed correctly. A journalist from the financial desk would ask it in 2 days. In a press conference hall. In front of 200 people. "Ms. Ashford Varelli, will you resume marital unity with Selim Varelli going forward?" Lyren would stand at that microphone and hear the question clearly. And she would pause. Not because she hadn't decided. Because the answer she had was not the answer the room was expecting. The press conference hall filled fast. By 9:50 a.m., both side rows had standing attendees. Financial journalists, corporate press, 2 network anchors, a row of shareholders who had requested observer access. The lighting was set for broadcast. The staging had been coordinated by Dree Calloway and cleared by both legal teams. The arrangement. Selim speaks first. Lyren stands to his left. They take questions together. Unified appearance. Stability signal for the market. The board had signed off. The attorneys had approved the framing. Lyren had agreed to attend. She had not agreed to anything else. Selim walked to the podium. He looked tired in the way that was real rather than performed. The tired of a man who has been turning the same ground over in his head for days without enough sleep to interrupt the loop. He had no notes. She could tell by his breathing before he started that this had been prepared differently. "I accepted and amplified information that had not been properly verified," he said. I made a public decision that should have been handled privately. I prioritized how things appeared over the people most directly affected by them. That was wrong. I accept that responsibility fully. The room stayed still. I was manipulated into serving an agenda I didn't design and should have caught earlier. That is not an excuse. It is an explanation. The distinction matters to me, even when it changes nothing about the outcome. In the third row, 3 shareholders nodded at the same moment. Financial reporters were writing. Stock had opened up 4% that morning, the market translating restored governance confidence into a number the way it always translates human complexity into something it can track. The 3 named board members had submitted resignations the previous evening. Aldridge's attorney had confirmed his client would cooperate with the federal inquiry. Draxon Capital's funds were showing early LP withdrawal activity, the beginning of an unwind that would take months to complete but had already started. Selim stepped back. He looked at Lyren. She walked forward. Her statement was 2 minutes. She confirmed the regulatory actions. She thanked the audit office by institutional name. She stated clearly that Tavan's rights had been protected and would stay protected. She did not say Selim's name once. Then the floor opened. 3 rounds: corporate governance, succession structure, market implications. She answered each one without extra language. The room was settling. The crisis arc was bending toward resolution the way these arcs bend when the documentation is solid and the financial picture is clear. Then the financial desk journalist raised her hand. Ms. Ashford Varelli, there's significant public interest in the personal dimension of this story. Will you and Mr. Varelli resume marital unity going forward? 200 people holding still. Lyren looked at the journalist, then at the room, then for just a second at Selim standing to her left. She turned back to the microphone. That question belongs to a private conversation, she said. Not this one. She stepped back from the podium. The room exhaled. Not silence. Collective release. An audience that had been waiting for something charged and received instead something measured. Selim's jaw tightened once. Not anger. Something quieter and harder. Then he straightened and looked forward. In the side hallway behind the conference stage, with the press room noise bleeding through the wall, he found her before she reached the exit. I was wrong, he said. No build-up. Just that. She looked at him. You were strategic, she said. There's a difference. Silence for a moment. I want to fix this, he said. She looked at him the way she looked at financial documents that didn't reconcile. Not with anger, but with the specific focus of someone who has already found the discrepancy and knows it doesn't correct itself by wanting it to. Some things don't get fixed, she said. They get restructured. She picked up her bag. One hand on the door. Then his voice, low, almost below the noise bleeding through the wall behind them. I'm going to propose restoring the marriage publicly, he said. At the shareholder gala. Formally. In front of everyone. She stopped, her hand on the door. She didn't turn around. She didn't respond. She pushed through and kept walking. The hallway outside held for a moment after the door swung shut. Then just the noise from the press hall. Packing. Equipment breaking down. The low churn of a room returning to nothing. Selim stood with one hand against the corridor wall. Not leaning. Just touching it. The way a person touches something solid when the ground has recently felt unreliable. Dree Calloway appeared at the far end of the corridor with her tablet. He shook his head once. She stepped back. He stayed there long enough for the hall to clear, for cameras to load out, for the building to go quiet the way buildings go quiet when the event they were arranged around has passed. Then he walked to the parking level alone. Outside, the financial ticker on the plaza screen read, Varelli Syndicate up 4.2%. Market restored. He got in the car and sat for a full minute before starting the engine. He had built an empire. He had just made a proposal in an empty hallway to the back of a closed door. Neither of those things, right now, felt like the same kind of power. Months passed. The way months pass when the documents are signed and the legal structure is set and life takes on the shape that comes after the shape that broke. Not identical to before, not entirely new, something in between that takes time to recognize for what it is. The hospital delivery suite was on the 4th floor. Corner room. East-facing window, which Lyren had requested specifically when the birth plan was finalized 6 weeks prior. She had been deliberate about the details. When the large things are unsettled, the small decisions become more important than they ordinarily would be. Labor was long. High stress, the attending physician noted in the chart, not from medical complication, but the kind of accumulated pressure a body carries when the mind hasn't fully set down what it's been holding. She had known this was possible going in. She had prepared for it. Noah arrived at 4:47 a.m., 7 pounds 2 ounces. The first sound filled the room immediately. Selim, seated in the chair near the window, leaned forward. He had arrived at 1 in the morning, not formally invited, not asked to leave, simply present in the way that some people are present when they've run out of words and defaulted to staying. When the nurse placed Noah in his arms for the first time, something moved across his face that had no corporate translation. It was unguarded in the specific way that only fully private moments produce. The kind of expression a person can't plan or manage, it just arrives. He didn't try to speak. He held his son and stayed quiet. Lyren watched from the bed. She felt it too, the particular weight of a new life, its complete indifference to press releases and metadata and board votes, its insistence on being only what it was. She let herself feel it without managing it. Let it be real without deciding what to do with it yet. Tavin arrived at 7 in the morning, still slightly rumpled from sleep, having spent the night with her sister. He walked directly to the bassinet with the seriousness of a child who had been thinking about this moment for months. He leaned forward with great care and pressed his forehead gently to Noah's. "Hi," he said. He straightened up and looked at his mother with an expression that communicated, clearly and without performance. "I approve of this." Lyren laughed. It came before she could decide whether to allow it. Real, unmanaged, entirely her own. She hadn't laughed like that in 3 months and she let it stay. Selim looked at her from across the room. She looked back. Neither of them spoke. There was a version of that morning that could have become a turning point. In a different story, a softer one, new life dissolves the weight of what came before. Soft light, a sleeping baby, history made gentle by the presence of something innocent. This was not that story. Lyren had known that since the corridor behind the press conference stage. She had carried the knowing quietly, let it settle in the months between, and decided what to do with it long before this room. 2 hours after Noah arrived, while Tavin was in the cafeteria and Selim had stepped out for coffee, an administrator knocked softly on the open door. "Ms. Ashford Varelli?" Sealed envelope, legal letterhead. She opened it. The custody amendment proposal. Drafted by her attorneys per her own instructions, filed the prior week, and timed for post-birth delivery per the legal team's recommendation. Protected Noah fully. It formalized Tavin's designation. It established co-parenting terms with clear schedules, defined roles, and protection for both children under any future financial or legal pressure. It also permanently separated their marital assets. Not punitively, as structure. Selim came back to find her reading it. He looked at the envelope, then the document, then at her. She held his gaze and said nothing. He set the coffee on the windowsill. He sat in the chair by the window. Noah slept through all of it. The sky outside had gone fully light, wide and clear and moving forward, the way mornings always move regardless of what happens in the rooms beneath them. The study in the estate's east wing had bookshelves from floor to ceiling and a fireplace that had not been lit in years. Selim chose this room. She understood why. It was where they had always made the decisions that required stillness, quietly, without audience, in a space that had absorbed enough of their shared history to hold whatever came next. He was communicating something through the choice of room. She acknowledged it and said nothing about it. She sat across from him. The documents were finalized. The asset separation framework was signed. What remained was the only question he had been building toward since the hallway behind the press conference stage. He asked it without ceremony. "Come back," he said. "Not for the optics. Not for the event. Come back because what we built together is worth more than what happened to it." She listened to every word. Then she let it sit for a moment before responding. Not for effect. Because she had learned that the answers that matter most deserve the few seconds required to make sure they're complete before they leave your mouth. She had thought about this conversation more times than she admitted. Early mornings, late nights. She had let herself feel what was actually true. Not the legal framing, not the press version of her. What was real and hers. She had loved him. That was never in question. It just wasn't the same thing as returning. "I forgive you," she said. No delay. No condition. She meant it completely. He looked at her. "Forgiveness isn't restoration," she said. "I know the difference now. And so do you, if you're honest about what happened and why it could." The fireplace was cold. They hadn't lit it. "Tavin has what he needs. Noah will have what he needs. You'll be present for both of them, as their father, not as a title. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's where we land," he said. Not a question this time. "Yes," she said. "And it's a better place than where we were 4 months ago." He nodded once. Slowly. The nod of a man accepting something he had been hoping not to accept. Not without grace, just finally done. The co-parenting agreement was signed that evening. 3 months later, Lyran launched the foundation. Biotech regulatory reform. Specifically the gaps in chain of custody verification and third-party lab oversight that the Helix Core case had made visible and documented. She hired a policy director and a communications team and went to work the way she had always worked. Methodically, without announcement, until the results became impossible to overlook. She testified before a Senate subcommittee. She brought the timestamps, the metadata, the watermark analysis. Language clean enough for legislators who had never worked in a lab to understand exactly why the gap existed and what closing it required. The reform bill passed on a Tuesday. She got the call in a hallway, said thank you, and kept walking. Draxon Capital's fund collapsed 5 months later. No drama. The LP investors withdrew, the positions unwound, the fund closed quietly. Aldridge cooperated. The shell companies dissolved. The story moved off the front page. Stories always do. The estate was divided. Lyran kept the East Wing. Selim kept the corporate residence. Tavin moved between both without confusion because both of his parents made certain he never had to carry what wasn't his. Noah grew. There was one evening, ordinary, nothing on the calendar, when Lyran was at the kitchen island reviewing foundation documents and Tavin climbed onto the stool beside her and placed something on the counter without comment. $1.43. The same coins. He had kept them. "What's that for?" she said. He shrugged the way children shrug when the answer lives inside them but the words haven't formed around it yet. "Just keeping them," he said. She looked at the coins. Then she went back to her documents. He sat beside her and did his homework. No request. No explanation. Just present. The kitchen was warm. The lights low. Outside, the east garden was dark and still. He had built an empire. He just hadn't realized she was the foundation. He didn't lose his family. He lost the right to stand at its center. And she walked forward from that place. Not bitter, not broken, not loud about any of it. Just clear. The way women are clear when they've already decided and the deciding is done. If the story moved something in you, if Lyran's strength, Tavin's coins, or the quiet way truth surfaced hit different today, drop a comment right now. Tell me, what was the moment that stayed with you? Share this with someone who needs a story about holding your ground when everything around you is being used against you. Someone in your circle needs this today. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell. The stories coming next are just as layered, just as real, and just as worth your time. You don't want to miss what's next. Neither would Lyran.